This episode of Simple Civics EdTalks is sponsored by informedsc.org, South Carolina's most comprehensive and user-friendly nonpartisan data center for critical information about students, teachers, achievement, and funding for public education. Bringing together district and state-level data, informedsc.org is a one-stop shop for researchers and champions to advance knowledge and inform action. InformedSC.org is a special project of Public Education Partners, Greenville County. The South Carolina state budget is about $39 billion, and hundreds of millions of those dollars support our public schools, funding everything from school buses to teacher salaries to classroom supplies. Over the next few months, the state legislature will debate how to invest tax dollars and other revenues, while at the same time, Greenville County Schools works to build its own budget for the 2026-27 school year. This is Catherine Schumacher with Public Education Partners. On today's episode of Simple Civics EdTalks, we will dig into the complex process behind our state budget and why it can complicate budget making for our local school districts. I'm joined by McLeer, Director of Public Policy and Community Engagement for Together SC, our statewide nonprofit alliance. Well, I'm excited to be here with my friend, McLeer, with Together SC and all of his other hats that he wears. We've been working together for a long time in this space, and thanks for making the time to have a conversation about budget. We're both budget nerds. We're sort of policy nerds together, and so we've done some work on Simple Civics EdTalks around particularly budgeting and how schools are funded in South Carolina, and this is an obvious follow-up to that. And we wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the process for our state budget, which is just getting underway. We're recording early in January, and so the legislature comes to Columbia next week. They've already been there doing a lot of work. But I thought we could talk about sort of that process and how the sausage gets made with the state budget, and then put that in the context also of what Greenville County Schools is getting ready to dive into in terms of their budget. So to start off, the budget process, sure, the legislature doesn't convene until the second week of January, but the process already started, and it started in the fall. So talk us through a little bit about what happens, like what's the homework that our elected officials and agency heads and all of that have been doing really since the fall.
Yeah, agency heads in particular really don't get any time off of budget mindset. So usually around the end of September, every agency in the state, of which there are many, must submit budget requests to the governor's office. And those requests are also what go originally to the House and Senate committees that build the budget. But they are due to the Department of Administration. They're available online. You can see them.
Yeah, if you really want to nerd out, like you can nerd out as deeply as you want, early and often about budgeting. So
you don't have to wait for the budget debate to nerd out. And so they're submitted to the governor's office in particular. That is so the governor can craft his executive budget. That executive budget comes out usually right when the legislature comes back in January. And so the governor needs all that information up front so that they can make their proposal, although not law, but their proposal on what they think the state's priority should be. So those agencies are working throughout the summer. Immediately on July 1, when the new fiscal year hits, their agency heads are already thinking about the next fiscal year because their homework is due by the end of September.
Right. So that's all the agencies, all the departments, including like the Department of Education, the Education Oversight Committee. So both of those have their own. Any sort of organizations and agencies that get state funding, it all goes in one great big pot.
Yes.
The governor. And then, so talk a little bit about, so now all of this information has come in to House Ways and Means. So just the logistics are, and this is sort of state law, the budget starts in the House every year. And so all of this conversation is happening in the House. And so the House Ways and Means Committee runs this process, and they steer the ship. And so Representative Bruce Bannister, who is here in Greenville, he is the chair of the Ways and Means Committee, and so it is his purview to run this process. So talk a little bit about, particularly from an education standpoint. So I know there's different committees that look at all of this and then kind of move things towards the full committee. So what does that look like?
Yeah, so something that's unique, I think, about education is the state superintendent obviously has, Superintendent Weaver has her bucket of money for her agency, but as you said, there is a bunch of others that are tied to education. Commission on Higher Education, the Education Oversight Committee. You also have First Steps now, that is a standalone. And so you have all of these different education-related agencies that do have to coordinate a little bit. So there's some coordination and some, well, who's going to ask for what based on the revenue source that is most eligible to be used. So that's school funding as a whole whole thing.
Yeah, it's really complicated.
It's very complicated.
Yeah. And there's some school funding that is mandated by statute. So those funds, and so you have different committees that work on, all right, we know that we're getting this amount of money. How are we going to parse that out? And what are we going to put it towards?
Yeah. And so there's a little bit of coordination, particularly between the Education Oversight Committee and the Department of Ed on who's going to ask for what and what source of funding is best suited to support that request. It goes to not only Governor, but as you said, Chairman Bannister. This year, 2026, is the second year in a 2-year cycle. So those budget hearings actually will happen fairly quickly.
Yep.
In comparison to where they started in 25. The legislature is a 2-year cycle. When you hit that first year of that cycle, A, there's new members because it's after an election.
Right.
And B, there's no bills in process yet. And there's also new committee members. And so they're a little bit slower to start on those years. This year, though, they'll have 1 year under their belt already of experience, and they'll be able to move a little bit faster.
Yeah.
Ways and Means Committee is separated into various subcommittees that consist of 3 members, and they will hear budget requests from agencies.
So they do presentations.
They'll have to go to the State House, to a subcommittee room, do a presentation on the highlights of their budget request, field questions from those members. They will go through all state agencies, and then they will have a big committee meeting where all the subcommittees say, "Well, here's what we think is possible to do and should be our priority." And you did mention available funding,
yeah,
and I think we should mention the Board of Economic Advisors for the state, the BEA, who their job is to tell the state, here's how much money we think you're going to have to use.
And they hear that in like February?
They hear it numerous times throughout the year. Right. In fact, there's already an estimate out already, but it is refined every other month almost, if not earlier. Ways and Means Committee will get a version, an estimate. There's always an estimate around when the Senate starts their debate as well. And then there's also an estimate usually right at the tail end. And over the last few years, it has been positive news that there is more available funding. And so some of those requests that maybe didn't get fully funded
might get thrown in at the last minute.
Might get more, an extra boost.
So the House kind of is going through this January, February, March. And usually is it always called H1?
Yeah, well, that's not the actual bill number, but everyone calls it H1.
Everyone calls it H1. Yeah. That's like the little lingo for y'all. And so then the House there's floor debate.
Yes.
A lot of floor debate sometimes.
A lot of floor debate.
There can be floor debate about provisos. And so provisos are these weird little special laws that get attached to the budget without going through sort of the full legislative process of subcommittee and hearing, but they have to connect to money somehow.
Correct.
So a lot of times there'll be provisos about school stuff because school stuff involves money.
Yes.
I'm trying to think of ways to kind of explain provisos in particular because we hear a lot about them.
It's like if you were in your family are sitting down and saying, okay, well, this week we're going to spend $50 to go out to eat one day. That may be the budget. But a proviso might be someone saying, well, actually, let's not spend that $50 on tacos. I want to spend it on anything but tacos.
So it's directive.
Yes. So it's, I still have $50. But I have to spend it on certain things. That's an example. It could be a lot of things. There's a lot of complexity to some of these provisos.
And I mean, some recent provisos we've had, there have been provisos about book content. They're just from a kind of a hot topics recently. Book content, CRT, all of that has been kind of handled in proviso because it got kind of bogged down sometimes in the legislative process.
Yeah, in education sometimes it's, and other areas too, it's you can't use this, you can't use our money to do X, Y, Z.
That's right.
That was another one during COVID of what you could use your money for. Right. And that's where some additional funding from the federal government sometimes is another dynamic that education has to wrestle with at times. But provisos take up a lot of floor debate on the House and Senate side.
And they get spicy.
They can, because those can be drafted in the moment. They're not vetted by a subcommittee or a committee. There's no public testimony on those. And sometimes there's not a lot of time to react because you're talking about usually in the House, if it's a very contentious year, 4 days of budget debate. And by the 4th day, the budget is approved. So you really only have like 2 days of going back and forth. And
it can go hours and hours. The wee hours of the minute. So then the House does their version and then the Senate takes that, chews it up.
They start all over again.
Oh, they start all over again. See, I'm not even an expert in this.
Well, technically, they take the House version. The Senate has the ability to say, no, we're going to do our own thing.
Right.
Now, of course, there are usually a lot of carryover
And they
crossover,
speak to each other,
and they talk to each other. There's a lot of coordination there, but the Senate is able to make any adjustment they would like. And so they do that. And at the same time, after the House Ways and Means Committee has their committee hearings for all those agency heads, and the superintendent of education gives their presentation, a couple weeks later, they're giving it to the Senate Finance Subcommittee.
Yeah.
And so they're doing that presentation 2 times, and the Senate is making their own decisions.
Right.
They might be informed, like I said, by what the House does technically, but they are also arriving at their own conclusions on what they think is best.
And so then, from a practical standpoint, so you'll see sometimes there'll be slight differences. And for instance, the amount of, if there's new money that the state wants to put towards teacher salaries, the House might have one number and the Senate might have a different number. And so you go through these 2 processes, and then at the end, they have to match.
They do. You can't have 2 budgets. You can only have 1 budget.
And so then you get into a process, will the House go along with the Senate, or will the Senate go along with the House? And rarely do they choose to go along with each other.
Correct.
And so then you have to go to conference committee.
Yes. So there's once the Senate comes up with their budget, it goes back to the House one more time, and the House does what they call H2, another insider lingo. Sometimes direct appropriations are in the H2 version if they're doing them. It's
and direct appropriations is that the happy term for earmarks?
Yes.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Great. So there you
community
go.
investments.
Community investments, right?
And so those are in there. And so H2 is a big deal because that's the House's last bite. The Senate only really gets that one bite.
That one, yeah.
And then the House will send it back to the Senate, H2, and the Senate will say no or yes. At that point, they almost always say no because everyone's they want to tweak something. Usually it's not on everything. It's usually on a couple things that are different. And you can tell if the number is different in the House and the Senate, it is eligible for conversation in this conference committee. And the conference committee is 3 senators and 3 House members appointed by leaders of each body. It almost always is the chair of the Senate Finance and chair of House Ways and Means. Almost always is a couple other folks. And they will get together and they will work out those differences. And again, where they agree, they're going to stay agreeing. It's where the differences are, and they will either take the House version or the Senate version. On the budget side, they don't meet in the middle. They have to take one of the 2.
I didn't know that. A lot of times you will hear that one of the sometimes education, I remember there was talk at the Clemson, the new vet school at Clemson was a thing a couple of years ago. So often education is part of this process. The other thing to keep in mind when you think about the legislature generally is everything is supposed to be done by a certain time.
Yes.
And it's almost never done, particularly the budget.
Correct.
So then they do this, it's called Sine Die. Sine
Die is the second Thursday in May.
And they're supposed to be done.
They're supposed to be done at 5 p.m. that day. On the nose, 5 p.m.
And if they aren't,
right before then, or sometimes a couple weeks before, they will pass the Sine Die resolution. And it's an agreement between the House and the Senate of, hey, if we're not done by 5 o'clock,
keep working on this other
we'll
stuff.
keep working, but here's the list of things that we can talk about.
That's
the budget is always on that list.
Yeah.
And then they have until June 30th to really figure it out.
So this process is going on basically between, January or before January for the pre-work, January and let's say June.
Yeah.
So meanwhile, here in Greenville and at school districts across the state, the district is also going through this process of how are we, creating the district budget for the coming academic year. And state funding is the majority of the school district budget. And you have to kind of balance that. There's some federal money coming in and the local tax dollars that are involved. But generally speaking, the state money is really important. And so when the district starts its process, which, they start also in the fall. So principals put in their requests and department heads are putting in their requests. And so all of that funnels in, again, to sort of the leadership team in the finance department at Greenville County Schools. And that process is also starting right now. And so there will be a long series of conversations between now and I think April, which is when the board of trustees for the district sees the first pass at the district budget. There are, I think, over 20 internal meetings to crunch numbers to see how this all works. And it's important to think about. So, you mentioned that February estimate. So the district has to kind of start somewhere on terms of revenues. So they start from sort of that February Board of Economic Advisors. That gives the district a sense of like, okay, so this is what they're hearing down in Columbia, so we can assume this. And so it's sort of best estimates.
Yeah.
So if you have any huge changes between that sort of what they're hearing in like February, March from the state, it makes it a lot harder to kind of navigate that budget process. So locally, we'll have the process is thank goodness a little less complicated for the school district. They have a workshop with the board in April that's open to the public and very public, and all that information is shared publicly. I went last year. It was really interesting for me. And then there's a first reading in May. They have a special meeting about the budget to approve that for the first reading. And then there's usually a second reading, and that is when the budget is approved. So down at the State House, they have to do 3 readings.
Yes.
And here they can do extra ones if they need to, but typically the goal is to sort of have the district budget approved at that June budget meeting, the second reading. But if there are any big changes, or perfect example, if a proviso gets stuck on with some sort of like unfunded or some, that really complicates things locally. And that can have implications for, the debate about millage increases here on the local side. The challenge, of course, being that what the resources are that the district can use for operations in particular is really complicated.
There are a lot of decisions made in Columbia in those last minutes, particularly if you throw in the wrench of then the governor gets the budget and can line item veto. And then you've got a debate on those line items. That hasn't necessarily happened in education in the last few years, luckily, for educators to have that unwariness, but it's a possibility that occurs.
Right.
And so there's a lot that hinges on what happens in Columbia for school districts up until whatever that day is. Sometimes it's June 29th that they adopt their final budget.
Yeah.
And that's when you know for certain that, okay, here's our number.
Right. And the other thing that we try to really emphasize for listeners, particularly as we talk about sort of the local school budget, and if you hear things about, and this is wonderful, right? The state wants to increase the minimum salary for teachers on the salary scale to above $50,000. Here in Greenville, we've been above that benchmark for a while. So Greenville has tried to sort of stay ahead of the curve on teacher salaries, and also because the district is so big, and they're what they're called steps. We've talked about them before, where, each year of seniority, teachers get a little bit of a bump, and their mandatory increases built into that, benefits, the increasing cost of insurance, and all of those sorts of things. Sometimes you'll hear that the state legislature is sending more money to districts, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be just sort of new money that isn't already spoken for. Just
Correct.
Because here in Greenville, there's also been talk about, enrollment is going down and losing teacher positions. That doesn't necessarily mean that the budget will get smaller.
Right, right.
And I think that's something that people assume that just because a budget is getting bigger, that it doesn't include some sort of cuts in positions or whatever. And with these podcasts, we're just encouraging folks to pay attention and be curious, and don't assume because you hear something coming out of Columbia that that the impact here in Greenville is exactly the same, because it's such a large school district.
Yeah, they're all different, and every district's going to handle every district also gets different kinds of funding sometimes from the state.
Right.
And so Greenville, and I would also add that there are decisions made at the district because the state has done XYZ, and not because of Greenville, but it could be positive or negative. But Greenville has to figure out, okay, if there's a gap, how are we gonna stay competitive if there's a competition gap, because employment is in a marketplace for like teacher salaries, but also if there's a funding gap, how are we going to meet those needs? And some of those decisions begin in Columbia. And that's why it's important for folks to kind of pay attention to Columbia and understand, okay, the decisions being made here are going to impact that school board meeting that are talking about budgets. And it's important to track.
Yeah. Thank you for having the conversation with me. And we've had a series of conversations about budgets. At Public Education Partners, we're really going to try and really follow this process pretty closely this year and try to just kind of keep an eye on it to help demystify it, because it is complicated. But we know that budgets represent an investment. It's how a community shows investment. And so particularly at Greenville County Schools, it shows, how are we investing the resources as a community in our schools and in our students that are in those buildings. So thanks for nerding out with me.
Of course.
About budgets today. Yeah. Did I forget anything?
Only the fun fact that the budget is the only piece of legislation required to be passed in the state every year.
Really?
And same for most any public entity. The only required law you have to pass is the budget, because otherwise you can't operate.
Well, I guess that's a good thing that we can get our budgets passed here in South Carolina. Chief McLeer, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks.
Simple Civics EdTalks is a joint project of Greater Good Greenville, Greenville First Steps, and Public Education Partners Greenville County.
Hi, Simple Civics Greenville County listeners, Nathaniel here. If you've made it this far, then we think you'll really love our newsletter. Sign up for bonus content, updates, and more right in your inbox. Look for the link in the description that says newsletter to sign up, or visit us at simplecivicsgreenvillecounty.org. Find the link in the menu that says newsletter and sign up there. We'll see you again next week.